So it gets much, much easier to assimilate human behavior to the rest of reductive scientific explanations of the universe when you reduce human behavior itself to something that's simpler than it actually is. Um, and so that's the overall concern with the projects that attempt to position humanity in the context of an evolving universe and then draw isomorphisms across the different layers of evolution and start to explain human behavior in terms of structural similarities to lower level behavior evolutionarily.
Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined again by Zak Stein, a fellow who again needs no introduction, a frequent contributor and an important voice in the communities related to the liminal web, integral thought, metamodernism, developmental thinking, etc. At least those are the sorts of people that are engaging very deeply with Zak's very important work. Zak is deeply involved in the Consilience Project and the Civilizational Research Institute, doing some important work in existential risk, among many other things. So after saying no introduction needed, that's sort of a brief introduction for you. But what we're going to talk about here is Zak and I are really engaged, I think, in similar kinds of projects. I think in your book, or I should say David J. Temple's book on first
Other,
principles.
yeah,
Um,
the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, our friend
Yes,
David
yes, your
Temple.
friend.
Yeah.
He talks about a postmodern project for the reconstruction of values, something to that effect. And I think we're engaged in similar sorts of projects. And so this conversation, now that you've had a opportunity to look at my recent book that came out, tackling a lot of the same concerns around that endeavor, yeah, I wanted to get your take on it, get some critique, get some thoughts on where we might diverge or converge or whatever. So I appreciate you taking some time to give me your thoughts and see where this goes in terms of this really important project that we're both kind of doing our own work on. So thanks, Zak. I appreciate you coming back on the podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Yeah, and so yeah, your book was, I read it in about I don't know, a day and a half, and you had read my book, and we talked about that. And so we were in an email exchange, and it kind of came clear, like, let's just talk because we do enough writing
Yeah.
uh, to talk. And I think it's useful to think about to get started continuity of this work that we're doing, this reconstructive work with other historical projects that are very, very similar. And so, like, one of the things that was resonating with me as I read your work and in our email exchange was our shared interest in Jean Piaget.
Mm.
And that's where I first encountered really serious grappling with explanatory constructs that bridged the physical, the early biological, the complex biological, the early human, and the complex human. Let's put it that way. So this is like, we could call it a full spectrum evolutionary theory, an integrative evolutionary theory that tries to explain human growth. So Piaget in particular is trying to explain moving from being a young child to being a scientist, or moving from, you know, so-called, like, prehistoric humans to being these humans that build computers and fly to the moon and stuff. How do you explain that in terms that are analogous to the way that we would explain the emergence of life on Earth and the emergence of complex biological life forms and their evolutionary processes? Um, and that's a very important conversation. So Piaget's book, Structuralism, which is part of a trilogy of books that he wrote with UNESCO on characterizing a science of transdisciplinarity that would address this type of issue. His book, Biology and Knowledge, also in this vein. After Piaget had looked at Charles Sanders' Peirce, and then you realize there's a vein of conversation that Piaget picked up from that goes back through the American pragmatists, even before Darwin, to people like Herbert Spencer, who identified complexity, in particular complexity, as the thing that was driving the universe in a way that was both physical, biological, and cultural civilizational.
Hmm.
So that's Herbert Spencer. That's before Darwin, actually. And then you get Darwin, and then you get the emergence of the post-Darwinian attempts to explain that full sweep of cosmic history. It's very interesting. There's a bunch of books that categorize just that. This guy, I think Robert Richards, talks about Darwin and the emergence of evolutionary theories of mind and behavior, I think is the name of the book. And that's where he looks at Spencer, Darwin, and then, of course, people we know like James Mark Baldwin and William James, and then up through Charles Sanders Peirce. Now, what's interesting about Peirce and Piaget in particular, and then I'll kind of get to my point. I'm just kind of laying out context. What's interesting about Peirce and Piaget in particular is that they took as the thing to be explained, meaning like human behavior. So like there's something about biological life and there's something about what humans do that's different. That's just like there's something about rocks and there's something about plants that are different. It's kind of clear that you wouldn't argue that. Most people anyway. Of course, there are many, many, many things that are the same given, but there's a lot that is quite different between plants and rocks. And such with plants and squirrels, and then, squirrels and humans, let's say. So like, but their bar for what it meant to be sapient was quite high because they were trying to explain the success of science, and even more specifically, the success of the linguistic practices that allow for science. Um, and so that's why Piaget became very interested in what he called necessary knowledge. This was knowledge that was obligate to be a certain way because reality was a certain way. And his claim was that, like, prior to the emergence of the human, the processes in nature were contingent and causal. There was not a sense of freedom, meaning determined through self-applied law, but there was certainly randomness, indeterminacy, probability, stuff like that. So Piaget lays out, as does Peirce, this distinction between a realm of causality and a realm of normativity or a realm of reason. And so science, if it's to be anything, needs to be a practice that's governed by laws of necessary thinking, and then ways of coupling formally correct thought to practice to revise that thought. So this is philosophy of science, things like that. This is harder than the problem of the hard problem as it's typically characterized. This is harder than the problem of sentience, is the problem of sapience. And this would be Robert Brandam's characterization of this debate, which emerged post-Darwin. Right? And so this question of what is irreducible to the biological, it is not awareness, and it's not teleology, but it is something like autonomy, which isn't agency, but agency bound by self-given law, which is a reflective practice, which is social and linguistic. So that made Piaget and Peirce have to get unorthodox in their evolutionary theory, because they realized that evolution produced this thing. If you simplify the output of evolution, meaning you make it so, as people do with Piaget's work all the time, you just change the thing you're trying to explain. And of course, the kid can do it now. you just downgraded the thing that is of interest here, the explanatum. So if you do that and you make it so that humans don't have access to universal truth, for example, or you make it so that the scientific learning processes with regard to the physical world and the learning processes that we have in the social world could be arbitrary um, projects that attempt to position humanity in the context of an evolving universe and then draw isomorphisms across the different layers of evolution and start to explain human behavior in terms of structural similarities to lower level behavior evolutionarily. The risk is that to make that work, you downgrade the human and make them reducible to computation, algorithm, information, in which case you're playing into the hands of reductive, transhumanist, neo-Darwinian, arguments against human dignity, of which there are many, and most of them come from this style of thinking, that in fact, no, it was the old way, the superstitious way, that somehow made the human irreducible and special in nature. But in fact, that's just our opinion. The human is not irreducible or special in nature. They're algorithmic, they're determinable, and replaceable by something that is better. This is a transhumanist argument. So I'm very, very interested in arguments that
Mm-hmm.
make it really hard to be a transhumanist and really hard to take away human agency and fold it into the broader mechanism of evolution.
Yeah.
And so, please, I've said way
Yeah.
too much. Just kick
No,
it off.
no.
I'm
Yeah, yeah.
curious. That's a
So,
little bit of what I was trying to get out in the email, but
yeah.
that was a little bit of pontificating.
No, I think so. You're naming a concern, which is a very legitimate one. And we see this in extreme, and I would argue, kind of pathological form in early kind of mechanistic thought, right? If you read like Hobbes, right, he's like, what is the body but a machine, and what are the organs but gears, and this sort of thing, right? It's kind of crudely mechanistic. And out of sort of you could even say the excitement of sort of early scientific thought, there was the hope of, hey, we're able to explain really well using Newtonian laws and mathematics and things how the heavenly bodies move and how machines operate. Maybe we can just kind of do this with everything. And it's this kind of blanket, it winds up being very crude, reductionistic, deterministic, and mechanistic. And that is sort of a natural outgrowth of trying to make that move. And so but you're, I think, also naming that there are subtler ways of doing that as well that we want to be careful about. Um, and so I agree with all of that. What I would say though is important and maybe even necessary for a kind of scientific anthropology, right? And we can come back to this. Maybe such a term is, contradiction of terms in your mind. I'm not sure, but like trying to think about the human experience and trying to position humanity within the broader evolutionary cosmos that we've come to gain greater understanding of. It seems like some project like that should be possible and maybe even inevitable if we're going to advance our self-understanding and properly situate ourselves within cosmic evolution. And so, I think this came up last time, which is that there are meaningful continuities and discontinuities in that cosmic evolutionary process. And a lot of the pathology comes around when we confuse those boundaries, when we see continuity or discontinuity where it isn't there, and we make these kind of false either delimitations or kind of usurpations or appropriations into areas where they shouldn't be. So my claim and my attempt, and something I'm trying to do with this whole work, is to do as best I can a project like that, which is if we can adequately carve nature at its joints, so to speak, in a kind of philosophical way, and we're actually getting an optimal grip on where those discontinuities lie, but we're also being very sensitive to the kinds of pitfalls that you're describing of how this can maybe tend towards certain kinds of, simplistic mechanization and reductionism and all of that. I think that it's possible. My hypothesis would be that um, we can get successively better and better at trying to explicate more and more the nature of the human, how it is continuous with early evolutionary processes and discontinuous, and that we can begin to identify the dynamics behind those discontinuities would be one way of thinking about it. Now, I find Greg Enriquez's you talk model really helpful for being able to name those kinds of joint points, right? So like you've got matter, life, mind, and culture. And I think, and I based just on what you said, it seems like where we would want to dig into this a little bit is somewhere around when you get to the human plane. My contention would be we can meaningfully situate humanity as part of this cosmic evolutionary process that's continuous but also discontinuous. And then we want to dig into what are the mechanisms of that discontinuity. But I get a sense maybe from you that there's something about the human that is maybe, I don't know, inaccessible to scientific attempts to do something like that. Or maybe I'm misreading it because, yeah, well, so go on about like, would you say that hypothetically speaking, it would be possible to offer a like scientific and I would argue kind of a naturalistic sort of account of what I'm talking about, or is that smuggling in a kind of metaphysics that you think is inappropriate? Yeah,
So, but this is the question: is what are
yeah.
we doing? So, I don't. I in the work that I do with David and Gaffney here at the center in Wilbur, uh, we're not making any claims to be scientists. So I think that's important to get. So like, it's what are we doing? Like what? Like so like I can't do the math to be a complexity scientist, or to understand Shannon information theory. Like it's a very complex logarithmic probabilities, things of that nature. And then sets of differential equations and other things involved in complexity theory. So I don't do that. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a journalist. So I'm not kind of reinterpreting for kind of like just bringing science to the public. That's not what I'm doing either. As a philosopher, I understand myself as a philosopher. Then I'm trying to rationally reconstruct a action orienting story that is as true as possible, that translates the special sciences across all the different fields into kind of something that provides access for everyday people to
Hmm.
the field of value or to reality to
Yeah.
understand the world. So there's the Habermas's view, which
Hmm.
articulates in terms of just like the philosopher as a stand-in interpreter in a context where modernity and postmodernity have rapidly expanded all of this knowledge to the point where the everyday person has no idea what the human is or what the universe is, unless they believe traditional religious story. And then if they do, they don't know how to gel that story to the scientific
Hmm.
story, which is a fragmented story across 1,000 different, like 1,000 not being hyperbolic. It's actually more than 1,000 different types of specialized disciplines. So I see my role as that as a philosopher, and a
Well,
psychologist,
and
as a
just to
yeah,
piggyback on that, I think we're probably aligned in that. I don't identify as a scientist either. I'm trying to make a similar move of doing a translation effect of trying to digest and then synthesize a bunch of that specialized scientific knowledge as best as I can, but then translate that into a kind of holistic account that would be understandable by a lay audience in that sense. So I think
exactly.
we're engaged in similar projects like that.
Precisely, yeah, and it's important to get that's what after modernity, when the role of the priest and the Sunday sermon and the Vatican was not the center of meaning making. You had the newspapers and you had the academy, and then among them you had the philosophers who took it as their task to reconstruct the special sciences and reinterpret it in a context of trying to keep citizenry informed in where modernity brought democracy as well. So the philosopher is also in a context of dealing with the public and dealing with the existing religious traditions. That's the other thing you have to note is that
Mm.
they were ostensibly supplanted by in modernity by science, and it's kind of why the philosopher had to come to exist. Uh, but for the majority of the world, science did only supplanted them rhetorically and in terms of technology and things, but didn't supplant them in terms of the ability to provide meaning. So another way to say what I'm saying, all of that said, another way to say what I'm saying is that when you're doing that work, it's also a question of grappling with postmodernity's repositioning of the legitimacy of science. So that's another And this comes also back to the philosophy of language, right? Which is that, okay, when you're trying to explain to humanity what it is after all this time, it's been confused by the academy. Uh, what kind of language do you use? What kind of language you deploy? You want to speak as truthfully as possible, but you also want to find a way to um, sorry, I'm going to say this, to not uh, you know, tell a heretical story, which is which appears to be a different, better story, but isn't, right? Because I think so, for example, postmodernists would say, so you're telling me that we should believe a story about the universe that's being told by the very people who have brought humanity to the brink of destruction. Like that's what you're telling me, right? So that's what you have to get. So like Shannon information theory, all of that stuff emerges in post-war America. Like you're looking at complexity sciences developed in the context of military industrial research. Like you're looking at a whole bunch of objectifying, kind of like Rene Descartes style distance from biology and a whole bunch of things that allows them to do the experiments to tell you how biology works and dissecting people to learn how brain. So basically, there's this whole critique of science as the best way to disclose reality, right? So that if I'm telling a story to the majority of humanity about reality, do I continue to give hegemony to the sciences? Or do I find a way to actually position the sciences relative to the other valid discourses? Um, and that, so I think this becomes interesting. And this is where people like William James and Peirce, and then even up to update to Ken Wilber, who took this radical empiricism, who were like, yeah, physical science is great, but come on, there's all of this other range of human experience, which uh, just because much of it is either outside the realm of scientific explanation, especially material, mechanistic scientific explanation, and because it is also, let's say, hard to explain according to views of the universe that would have human experience emerge randomly from mechanistic process, meaning, and this is why James was interested in religious experience and Wilbur was interested in religious experience. And at the end of his life, Peirce ended up having a series of mystical experiences. Um, so there's this questioning,
Yeah. Well,
about the kind of storytelling we do.
yeah.
And
Well, okay.
this isn't, but let me say it's not
Yeah, yeah.
Harari. It's not like Yuval Harari saying we can any story is as good as any other. I'm actually saying precisely the opposite. I'm saying, do we choose to tell a story that privileges scientific, third person, reductive language? And if we do so, why would we choose to do that? Well, we know that's the very languages that has brought us to the precipice of the meta crisis. Um,
It just, yeah, it seems to me that you're taking as science what I would think of as a particular subset of science, a particular paradigmatic approach, which um, I think might have been predominant historically at certain points. Whether it even still is predominant is a question. But when I think about science, I'm thinking about a general method of making a hypothesis and then testing it, seeking empirical validation. If your hypothesis doesn't match the data, go revise, that, and then through that you get sort of, you could call like a meta scientific paradigmatic update, right? Where like if you do that enough working with a paradigm of mechanism and reductionism, then the data keep not fitting your hypothesis. You have to then go back and revise your paradigm to even be able to get a better understanding. And I would say that through the scientific process itself, there's a kind of ongoing self-corrective aspect that has led to more sophisticated paradigms, so that some of those things reach their own impasses, and then we're like, hey, maybe we're not getting success this way. Maybe we do need to look at idealistic framings, or maybe we do need to kind of totally shift our point of view here. And so I would say that is that when I hear you talking about, yeah, like the hegemony of the sciences for telling the story, there seems to be a lot of like guilt by association of like, well, complexity of science is related to these bad things that happen, and therefore we can't, like we shouldn't necessarily be listening to that. But I think that that'd be hard to avoid in any, like Darwinism. Look how that's been used and how, terribly destructive that's been. But like, we don't want to throw out theories of natural selection and all that. So that'd be just point one. And then point two was that seems to also then create some tensions with what you were just saying a minute ago about being a philosopher and how you understand that as someone who's interfacing with the sciences, but then trying to meaningfully translate them for people. And what you just said after saying that sounded more like, yeah, but maybe science isn't so much what we should be listening to or interfacing with if we're trying to tell meaningful stories. So anyway, those are just some things that came
No,
up
I'm
for.
saying if I'm a philosopher, I'm trying to explain how science actually works. And it doesn't really work the way you're describing. Now, that's how Popper would describe it. But once you get through the postmodern, post-Kuhnian, institutionalized techno science that's coupled to a state apparatus, you get
Mhm,
into a whole bunch of complexity that Habermas grapples with during the positivism debate,
mhm,
which is the tendency of the Anglo-Americans to depoliticize the practice of science and make it into some very abstract, formal thing, which doesn't exist in any laboratory. Anywhere there isn't science, there's sciences, many fragmenting dozens of different sciences, each of them with specific paradigmatic and measurement stuff. And so the task is to position science, uh, not to just re-articulate it, but to be like, here's what science is, here's how it works, here's why we take it more seriously than other things,
mhm.
as opposed to giving and presenting it as its reputation
Yeah,
precedes it, which is actually as a hegemon.
yeah.
Which and and so the other thing I'll say is that uh, the the basic practice of many fields is broadly speaking reasonable or rational, but which means there are better and worse ways of thinking about things and making conclusions and making arguments, way more reasonable positions than others. Truth can be said, in fact, without in any way being scientific. So I think that needs to be clear that, and this is one of the things, kind of the broader statement, is that when you present science without contextualizing, it also seems as if, which is how modernity presented it, that there is actually no other way to reasonably talk
Mhm,
about things. Habermas and other reconstructive postmodernists are like, actually, no, wait a second. There's
mhm.
a bunch of other ways to reasonably talk about things and other ways to even state truths that don't actually require that kind of
Yeah.
formal scientific practice. And the justification of the validity of the formal scientific practice is one of those things, which is not a scientific practice,
Mhm.
which presents itself as more or less reasonable thing to
Yeah.
do. And so that the contextualization of science in the overall narrative, and then the ability to continue to find ways to bring in religion, religious discourse,
Mhm.
that isn't dismissive in the way that modernity has been to religious discourse,
Yeah.
is also related to that ability to show that there are discourses that are non-scientific, that are not therefore arbitrary. Um,
Well,
and yeah, again, please.
yeah. So yeah, you brought up religion, which is where I kind of, all right. So a lot of kind of we went pretty abstract there, and that's good. And I want that in the background for all this. But I also want to jump back to what we were talking about in the beginning of this project of trying to situate the human within the context of cosmic evolution and how we might go about doing that. And you've raised some important aspects of being wary of just, oh, we'll just wholesale take whatever science is saying, and then we'll, and we should be cautious of that. And I totally agree. And then you're also foregrounding the importance of other kinds of approaches and potentially equally valid or more valid approaches for trying to get to the heart of these, which through the mention of religion brings me to a question that I want to ask you because it relates to, I think, maybe one of the areas where we diverge in our approach on this, which is my my sense would be that I get here. I'll set it up this way, but there's a couple different ways I could try to say this. If you go back in the past, there were attempts to think about that uniquely human phenomenon in terms of non-scientific and religious ways that seem kind of fundamentally not amenable to any kind of scientific analysis of any kind, or even rational causal investigation. For example, to say what I am is ultimately a soul, and this is outside of any purview of any kind of analysis or experimentation. If we're looking for what is kind of irreducibly human, we are ultimately then coming up against something immaterial, spiritual in nature, religious in nature, and maybe bestowed by a divine creator. And because that is the case, any attempt to do science that will try to situate the human with some degree of continuity with the broader evolutionary process is going to reach a ceiling where it can't do science anymore because it's not really engaging with the scientific object of study, if that makes sense. My question sort of is, what do you make of that position? Is that a way of expressing your own position? And if not, um, what do you make of the idea of being able to talk about what is that irreducible human aspect that that maybe wouldn't be just crudely reductionistic? It might be able to give a causal account, like let's say, for example, the information loops of a self reflecting on itself recursively. Dot dot dot. You could make a kind of argument, right, of in a endo-naturalistic frame that doesn't have recourse to something like a soul. But I'm wondering if that is kind of inherently what you're getting at as being problematic. Does that question make sense? Because I can try to say it again a few more times in a few
I
different
think
ways.
so.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, this is where you get to the work of the other reconstructive postmodernists like David Ray Griffin, and his work on re-enchantment without
Hmm.
supernaturalism. It's a very important frame for this.
Hmm.
And you also get the work of other scholars, and I would include David here. I'd include David J. Temple, if you will, right? Who
Okay.
are not attempting to posit anything outside the realm of scientific discourse, but also trying to clarify just what that realm is.
Hmm.
So it's not saying like, you know, so again, Wilbur, very important, right? So what does it mean to study the soul? What would it mean to study the soul? What would that mean? Is there a way to do that reasonably? Totally. That's what a Jungian does. Now, is the way to study the soul with material instruments and looking for something in the material world and trying to measure something with material instruments? That would be weird. That's not it. Now, if that's what you mean by science, then you've just limited science to a place where the only thing that is valid as admissible as evidence is something that can be physically measured or physically seen.
Hmm.
So that's like what would be called a narrow empiricism.
Hmm.
Right? So if I have a dream, and in the dream I have profound archetypal imagery, and it turns out after speaking to someone like Carl Jung that that imagery, which I never knew about, is found in a bunch of myths, right? Now he would talk about, and Hillman would talk about that being some evidence of something that you might call soul. Now this gets very complex because what are they talking about? They're not talking about a physically identifiable object, but they're also talking about something that is studyable and about which you can say way more or less reasonable things that can be way more or less helpful to people in changing material reality,
Hmm.
including their own lives. Um, so the broad empiricism, the radical empiricism, as William James would call it, specifically in this conversation, James is saying, no, we need a radical empiricism, guys, or else you're just basically saying that science is a thing that just studies material objects, right? When we know, James, as a psychologist, psychology starts as not studying objects, but studying phenomenology, studying introspection. That's how it started. Wundt and all those guys, and
Hmm.
Persis on the early experimentation psychology, which is experimentation in introspection,
Yeah.
just meditation. Where do you study the soul? In introspection, in meditation. Are there intersubjective verifiability processes in those domains? Yes. Right. So Ken brings in the whole tradition of contemplative prayer and meditation and other practices, like Jungian psychotherapy, which consistently reveal data, which can be intersubjectively confirmed or not confirmed. Right? Uh, so that's where I'm saying,
Yeah.
if we discuss the limits of science and we limit science to narrow empiricism,
Yeah.
then you're right. What I'm talking about in terms of soul isn't studyable that way. But if you broaden it, as I was
Yeah.
trying, as Habermas does, and says, no, there's this broader realm of things that are true. You can say true stuff and more or less reasonable things and be super helpful or not helpful or dangerous or not dangerous in these realms of discourse, but they're not about things that are measurable in any simple materialistic way, nor should they be expected to be
Yeah.
unless you are captured by this epistemology that holds the only thing
Yeah.
that we can talk about is this type of reproducibility of materially measurable phenomena.
So this is good. And what I would say though is and again, Wilbur can be helpful here because if you've got that quadrant set up, you've got the interior and the exterior. So,
That's not
uh,
what I'm,
hmm?
that's not the part of his thinking I'm referring to.
No, I know. I'm going to try to build off of what you just said to try
Okay.
to see what you think about something. So, you've got that interior and the exterior, which means in a way, you've got correlates of that interiority. Like a lot of what you were just describing, that kind of soul exploration and soul science, you could say. I know you talk about the interior sciences a lot. Um, that would be that kind of phenomenological, interior oriented, meditative kind of attention to consciousness, and that is an element of soul study. Sure. At the same time, even within kind of a Wilberian frame, you've got kind of the correlates, the kind of external correlates of that, like the in a sense, kind of the neural correlates of consciousness aspect to it. And so if that's the case, then there would seem to be also a kind of flip side to that kind of interior reflection that can also be done in terms of using more kind of conventional scientific methods that are objective in that sense. And what I would mean by that, right, would be, all right, if I cut off my arms or if I lose my arms, that's going to affect my interiority. All right. And so when I go thinking about my experience of reality, well, now I have no arms. And so I'm going to experience that shift in my external state. Right. And similarly, we could imagine all sorts of other kinds of shifts or changes to my externality that would affect me in a phenomenological way. And I would also argue that we could hypothetically, I think, identify key
Why
what?
did you cut your arms off?
Well,
I still can't confess
I,
why did you cut your arms off? I'm confused.
choose whatever you will in terms of I'm trying to think about some profound alteration of my body, right?
Right.
Because there's a sense in which my soul as experience is directly related to my embodied physicality. Um,
Right. I'm
and
not so I'm not positing something that is I'm saying so for example, like how useful is it really to study a symphony from a third person perspective without listening to it at all?
right,
Now, from one perspective, it's interesting, but not from the perspective of what the symphony
yeah,
is.
yeah,
I
yeah,
so that's what it comes to. It's not that you couldn't do brain science on someone when they're sleeping, when they're having an archetypal dream, but it's
mhm,
just that the point of doing psychoanalysis is to talk about and work with the imagery
sure,
as such, which means that you're saying true or false things outside of the ability to have them verified through material measurement. And the other thing to say about the brain correlates is that totally there are brain correlates to everything, but each brain is super unique, super unique. And
sure,
so that gets to be a very interesting conversation actually about like, well, like who, where, like where.
yeah.
I mean,
No, I know.
it
I
happened, but who cares where it
I'm
happened?
yeah, I'm just trying to get at so I'm sort of acknowledging what you're speaking to and validating it as a totally important and necessary aspect of soul study, let's say. I also am trying to validate the kinds of approaches that I'm particularly keen to explore. And so what I'm doing is just for the time saying, yes, interior phenomenological assessment, valid, but let's bracket that for a second. Let's also look at the kind of other side, the external side of those quadrants and see those physical correlates, you could say. And I think in doing that, we can actually learn some really important aspects that we wouldn't see if we just looked at the interiority aspect. For example, in the symphony, right? Like, yeah, like you take in a piece of Beethoven and it's just going to phenomenologically hit you, and you don't have to understand anything about music. It's going to affect your soul. You can also be a music theory student, and you can look at the notes on the page and be like, oh, oh, look, when he's doing this modulation here, that's what creates that sound. And oh, right. And then you're going to have different kinds of knowledge and experiences related to how you're engaging that phenomenon. Now, I bring all this up because one of the things that I'm trying to do in understanding the human is to particularly look at what we can assess in the external field that is more amenable to the kind of classical scientific study that we're talking about, and be able to see where those changes occur that might really meaningfully demarcate something specific to, the human being. And then we can have the conversation about, is this irreducible to this? Can we say that this is the cause of the interior? We can get to some of the more metaphysical things, but what I see as being possible, which I'm asking if you kind of also see this as at least being hypothetically possible, is if we were to just look at sort of the exterior aspects of things. If we were to say, hey, look, human beings have language, and that is predicated on a certain physiological setup and a neurological setup and all that. And it's the fact that we need to be positioned in social contexts where people are able to speak to each other, et cetera, all these things, et cetera. We can set up a kind of purely external way of approaching questions of what delimit human experience as being unique relative to those lower evolutionary creatures in a way that doesn't have to say all that other stuff that you were mentioning isn't a part of the situation, but we can just also focus on that. Is that tracking at all, or do you
Of
have any?
course. I
Yeah.
mean, that's been done many
Okay.
times. That's kind of the other reflection here is just there's a long history of people thinking about exactly this, and that question's been asked and answered in many different ways. I prefer Tomasello's work on that, which is
Hmm.
again experimental comparative psychology between chimps and young children.
Yeah.
And there he's looking at something that's truly irreducible,
Yeah.
that isn't explainable by something just located in one brain. It actually
Yeah.
requires multiple brains. And it's not just attention or sentience, it's a form of joint attention
Hmm.
mediated through abstraction. And existed before language exists before language.
Yeah.
And so it isn't language that's the differentiator. It's the thing that allows for language. And
Hmm.
that is a pragmatic relationship between conspecifics,
Yeah.
meaning me and my mom and the objective world,
Hmm.
basically. And so that I think is important to get. And it's primarily right hemispheric. And then eventually language comes, and language eventually gets propositionally differentiated and grammatically quite complex. And then the left hemisphere begins to take over.
Hmm.
But then alphabets come. That's much, much, much the fuck later do you get alphabets. And then you get the difference between the eventually Phoenician alphabets and the ideographical alphabets. That would be Chinese and like our alphabet, right? And then that sets up a whole other cascade of neurocognitive cultural differences that are quite deeply encoded when we think about sapiens.
Hmm.
So if you go way, 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 way back, and this is beget Piaget and Tomasello, like they're all asking similar questions.
Hmm.
It's not that like chimpanzees and dolphins and octopuses and crows are not incredibly hierarchically complex. They actually are. The issue is that they do not have this other thing,
Hmm.
which is this capacity for joint attention, which is actually a capacity for intimacy, for lack of a better word.
So this is kind of my thing then. It's like for me, that seems like a sufficient account uh for getting at that irreducible human thing, right? We started out this conversation, you were like, I'm concerned or I'm wary of attempts to situate the human relative to the broader cosmic evolution.
Totally. But
Yeah.
I'm saying that account, if I'm just reading your book
Hmm.
as I read it, I can't actually get to that from that prior view of the universe and information. That's the idea of that. So, for example, if there's a ambulance going by here, but if your main idea of what knowledge is, it's a whole complex topic, right? The idea that like, so, but if your idea is it is a model of the world that is more or less true, right? And then you get up into a situation of what does language do? Language allows us to represent the world as more or less true. And that so that's where this thing breaks, where like actually no, the primary function of joint attention and the primary function of language is not to represent the world. It is to coordinate, which means to create relationship.
But doesn't that require, so yeah, and so this is really good, and I really want to dig into this because I think again my sense has been we've been saying I think a version of the same thing, but there's a lot of semantic stuff
I
that I
mean, it's
want
worth mentioning like this is a very in-house like family dispute. Like,
to. Yeah, I
you
know,
know what
but
I'm
this
saying?
is
This
yeah.
isn't like we disagree on some big thing. It's like
Oh, I
a
know. No,
heavy
but
group that's
this is why
large.
this is so key because
Yeah,
like,
I agree.
you're engaged in the same kind of project that I am, and we're trying to drill down into this kind of first principles
Yeah,
approach.
exactly.
And so at
Yeah.
that level, it's sort of like I do also think that depending on at certain divergences, you can wind up getting these kind of cascadingly different
Well,
visions.
and again, then there's repeating history, right? So to reference stuff we both know, like Habermas. So if you look at Habermas, forgive me if I'm misremembering, but communication and the evolution of society. And there he's looking at this question, actually anthropologically. He's like,
Mhm.
what is it that creates not deepening sapience, but excuse me, yeah, not excuse me, no, not deepening sentience. Like it's not just about like some mystical deepening of some quality.
Mhm.
It's about this sapience. It's about this new form of relationship.
Yeah.
And he's going against, in a sense, Chomsky, because Chomsky is saying universal grammar somehow emerges as a genetic mutation in the brain that gives added complexity that allows for this language thing, and that the
Mhm.
root of it is adaptation for more complexity, potential in language production of the individual.
Mm.
Right? To which Charles Sanders Peirce said no long ago. He
Yeah.
actually came up with the term universal grammar, but then he also came with the term universal pragmatics and universal semantics. And
Mm.
for him, the triangle was such that pragmatics was core.
Mhm.
Habermas is actually kind of like secretly pulling from Persian tradition and saying, yes, that happened, Chomsky, but kind of at the same time, something else happened, which was the binding of male agency into the family unit and the creation of pre Dunbar tribal groups,
Mhm.
which means long duration intergenerational transmission
Mhm.
was created. And that's basically what he's saying. And Thomas L is pointing to that too. He's
Right.
like, it's not, it's you couldn't have the added linguistic complexity if there
Yeah.
wasn't a social container to receive it.
Yeah.
And the social container is one where gestures and other things are secondarily about the world. It's not that they're not about the world.
Right.
It's that they're so, and even ontogenetically, let's just go back to where there's actually data ontogenetically. What emerges? What's the sequence? And this is where Peirce is super interesting. Um, I, we, and it. How does that emerge? First, it's me, but then it's me and mom. If you are in this school of modernity I'm talking about, the argument really, no, it's you and the world.
Mm.
It's like you and the crib in the world. No, no,
Mm.
no. The world comes way later,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
Like way, any sense that there's an objective world and stuff out there is way, way, way later. It's first, it's me and mom or the
Right.
mother. Right?
Well, so yeah,
And
no, but I so I
that's so the first, all the gestures, all of
yeah.
that is not about the world.
Right.
It's about making sure you're going to be there, trying to understand if you're going to be there,
Yeah.
getting soothing from you, feeding, like all of that stuff. And so the root of what becomes language and logic and all of this stuff,
Yeah.
it's his point. Piaget says mom's first too. He says it in a different way than the Lacan would say it, but all the psychoanalysts would also say it,
Uh-huh.
it's you and this other,
Uh-huh.
not you and it. It's you and an other. And then
Right.
out of all the others, you distill the it's.
Yeah. I just read there's a great sentence in Mind, Self, and Society. that Mead says something like objects are only abstracted later out of social kind of
Yes.
ways of thinking.
Yes. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
Mead, yeah, Mead
yeah,
is exactly it. So if you look at Habermas's first book on post-metaphysical thinking, he's got this long chapter on Mead and this long chapter on Peirce. And that's where you find some of this argument,
yeah.
which is the answer. So the
Well, can I just say something? I want to say something real quick because I want to clarify. Because yeah, so I totally agree with all this. And what I would just be saying is that I'll put it this way. What I'm not saying is that language is just a way that we have added to be able to talk about reality, as so that we can build up a nice world model that we can more effectively navigate reality. What I
right,
would say,
but
oh, go
that's
on.
what your books, but that is what your book says.
No, well, I mean, what my book says is that language gets deposited on top of cognitive learning, and it does so inherently in a context of justification dynamics, so that what gets internalized is the other person. And I this is all in Mead too, right? That like I am only a self because I'm able to construct an ego using language, but language is inherently collective. And so there's once you get language, it's inherently a medium of collecting of bridging minds together, of interlinking minds together, so that what language is inherently social. But what I would add to that is that it is a communication system that allows collective action for means of enhancing viability as a kind of collective unit, right? Like a chimpanzee can't talk to another chimpanzee and then be like, hey, let's go do this. So every chimpanzee is sort of in their own egocentric umwelt, But with language, which bridges the minds of different people together, yes, it's social in all the ways we were just talking about. But I would also say that it's meaningful in a deeper sense of it is used to the degree that then people are able to engage in shared action, right? So then it's like, hey, let's go hunt this animal together. And when you get like large, animal hunting, attempts, then you've got to be able to do communal action, that sort of a thing. But it's like we have to understand that as an evolutionary process, because that means that that group of people is feeding themselves and is actually for the purposes of enhancing their viability in an evolutionary and an entropic world. So I'm trying to kind of sync up the whole social idea of language and justification as being both the means of the construction of the ego, but it's also the means of the construction of society. Those are interrelated and totally, entangled with one another. But all of that occurs in a way that gets deposited on deeper level aspects of, I would call it information processing, meaningful information processing of, entities in their context. That's kind of the point that I'm making. So I would just say, if the confusion is that I'm saying language is just this way that people talk about things so they can have a good world model, I would say yes, and right. It's like it emerges in a social context, but that has the consequence of bringing people to cohesively act as one or act together, you could say, but for the purposes of being more successful evolutionary agents, I would ultimately. And then you're kind of grounding that deeper down into that evolutionary process. But language is a discontinuous aspect of the evolutionary process. You don't see that in the lower animals. So like then it's like, oh, there's ego and there's group and there's society and there's meaning, and they're all kind of deeply interwoven with each other. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make, but maybe I don't do it very well.
I see. Yeah, it's different. In the book, it's different. I'm not going to go through and pull out things, but because I have it here, but I'm not going to do that because I should have prepared. But but it doesn't really matter because we're trying to like build the right thing now. And
And
so
and I this is a all, if you find instances like that, just personally, I'd be very happy to, I
there's
want
an
to
emphasis, and
yeah.
it's coming from your work moving from Azarian,
Mm,
uh, or whatever his name is, and like that moves out of this field where the organism is processing information to represent its environment.
mm, hmm.
And then as the organisms become more complex, the representation of the environment becomes bigger and more complex.
Uh-huh.
And then you get to a point of humanity where that becomes almost exponentially more
Uh-huh.
complex. And
Yeah.
that the value of the individual is their ability to contribute to that world model. And that
Uh-huh.
language allows us to share in the representational capacity that we build together to model the world together.
Uh-huh.
Like the pull that I'm coming from. And of course, the modeling of the world then allows for action, and a whole bunch of other things. And it's not that that view is incorrect. There's not. It's not that the view is incorrect. The argument is just that the representational language is secondary.
Hmm.
That's all. And uh, therefore, there's a whole realm of interaction and language use, which is not about that. But then, so the other thing I'll say is that this goes down further, right? So the idea that language somehow breaks the animal world out of solipsism just isn't true. Like animals are richly communicative. This is where one of Peirce's early work in semiotics and biosemiotics is so important. But they're told they don't have language, just like little kids don't have language. But little kids completely orient to the world based on gestures from mom about her knowledge of the world. And similarly, other animals not using language, but using their language, quote unquote, use messages from others to model the environment, and
Sure.
together they have this. So language
But
doesn't, it's not that language breaks us out of solipsism. It's more specifically back to the thing that differentiates us.
well, let me just to that point, I would say that there's communication before language in all the ways that you're talking about. But in terms of what I think language does specifically is it allows me to express my own interior subjective experience to you in a way that now you can have a sense of that, and we can act and coordinate our actions based on that. I think that animals lack that. And I think that when you look at the evidence of, for example, even when you give animals, the ability to sign, they don't say, "How are you?" or "What are we going to do today?" They say, "Give me food, give me food." There's an egocentric absorption there. Animals can use communicative gestures to read the world and see meaning in the world, but I don't think that animals have the ability to take the role of the other absent language. And again, I mean, I think Mead makes the same point as well, but I don't know.
But again, my point is that that's not language. Like that is the thing that allows for what you're calling human language. So let's break that. So there's semiotics. There's actually semiotics in the physical world, plant
Yep.
world,
Yep.
mammal world. There's all of this
Sure.
semiotic.
Sure.
None of it's language. Just humans use language. Let's say that.
Yeah.
So we're looking for this very specific human thing.
Yeah.
What allows for this human thing, which is propositionally differentiated speech, to be
Yeah.
more specific, I would
Right.
argue, with the formal pragmatic configuration of the three worlds,
Yeah.
which have to do with the semantic differentiation and all of that stuff, that all follows from pre-linguistic ability to hold joint attention.
Hmm.
And again, that is prior to semantics and syntax, there's pragmatics, which is ritualized joint attentional situations that don't convey information about the world
Hmm.
or about our internal states,
Yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
but establish interpersonal resonance. Uh,
Yes.
and so that is kind of the basic thing. And that's why it's easier to plug, I argue, easier to plug that into the prior stuff. But now the prior stuff has to be a little bit less dead because now you're not looking for just exchange of information. You're looking for something that sounds more like a configuration of intimacy.
Hmm.
Um, and so that I think it's been neglected and Piaget even encountered this prejudice, neglected in Western scientific research to study this phenomenon because it is the domain of the domestic, it's the domain of child rearing.
Hmm.
Is actually where you see the most remarkable non-linguistic obvious difference between humans and other mammals.
Mm.
And so that's just saying that the presence of not something unique in my brain, but in the field
Yeah.
between humans, right? That isn't language, but allows for language, which is this joint attentional situation.
Is that uniquely human, would you say?
That's what I'm saying. That's the
Yeah.
argument. And that, and so then you're now when you look at language, what that allows for is representation. But what you mean by representation and why it's different than how an animal represents the world is that it's a representation that claims to be true, which means it's subject to counterfactual and inference and hypothesis and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so that's what Piaget talks about when he starts talking about formal operational language use. Whoa, animals are not even close to that. Like they're gesturing and doing all kinds of stuff, but they're not in this realm where they are taking propositional attitudes, which means they are making implicit truth claims about everything they're doing, which is much, much more complex than just having some kind of image that there's a predator around the corner. Knowing that telling someone there's a predator around the corner commits you to a dozen different inferences and a dozen different other interpersonal commitments and other
Hmm.
things. It's a completely different situation of mindedness, which moves you into proper sapience. And proper sapience is, again, recognizing that representation follows from pragmatic commitment and social status. This is where it all gets Hegelian, because you start to get into a situation where, oh, actually, how does language work really in that context of intergenerational transmission?
Hmm.
It's me and you making claims about the world to which we are subject, meaning
Hmm.
like to which we make commitments. Um, and That's an essential difference between the animal gesture and human communication contexts.
Hmm.
It's what Habermas again calls the formal pragmatics of it. Um, and that allows us to do incredible things because we can build whole abstract worlds together,
Hmm.
uh, and coordinate action, make commitments, and do a bunch of stuff with language that allows us to represent the world. So,
Yeah.
like science is, and this is Persa's big point, science is first a bunch of social commitments.
Hmm.
Then, given that we're all practicing these social commitments, uh, then we're like, oh, look, we can see the world together and trust each other to represent data and do all of this other stuff because we're committed as science to a certain set of social commitments. That was one of his big insights that set off the postmodern reflection on science. So science isn't hypothesis and all that checking and stuff. It's a community of inquirers together
Hmm.
who make a commitment to a greater good of inquiry.
Hmm.
And absent that, you get all the stuff we have now with science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, just on, that last bit, I think, I don't, yeah, have any disagreement with that. I see all that there. I guess maybe for me, what I was going to say is that when I talk about modeling the world, I don't mean that in like a crude, oh, like, oh, let's make a perfect mimetic, representation. And so we can now, I mean that like everything that I do today relies on me being able to navigate the world effectively. And so I am going to need to have some kind of connection with as I move through my environment. I need to be able to not stumble over things and whatever. But then I also, if I just go around banging people over the head and not, considering how my actions are going to affect other social agents, then I'm also going to be, I'm going to get a rude awakening. So that means that in order to, again, kind of I would say model the world, I have to be cognizant of how I'm relating to other agents and how there's all, And so I use that kind of language because I use it as a nice kind of shorthand to be able to say, in an evolutionary sense, I need to be able to successfully navigate my environment. And for that, there needs to be some kind of internalized version of that. And when social agents come together to do science, let's say, I would say that what even though the consequence of that is actually doing that more kind of, oh, let's model the world together, just getting together in the same room and having conversations and doing things together is a modeling of the world. But all of that's kind of playing out in the social environment that needs to have, predicated some kind of basic successful pairing of agent and arena, I guess is kind of the whole idea. But so maybe anyway, takeaways for me in terms of being more careful with language around what people might interpret the idea of modeling the world to mean, or representing the world. I see those as being incredibly complex, multi-layered. Even the term information processing, right? Like I think that that's a very fine way of talking about inputs and then, what sense I'm making from these sorts of things. But I don't know, maybe you would see that as being too dangerously mechanistic in tone or something.
No, again, I'm in a sense I'm saying that the yeah, like insofar as David J. Temple might be at risk of being declared pre-modern, even though it's trying to factor the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern.
Hmm.
You are likewise trying to factor pre-modern, modern, postmodern, but I
Hmm.
would declare that maybe you're a little bit too modern.
Hmm.
That the insights of postmodernism actually problematize specifically the language you're adopting, which is the language of representation
Hmm.
and knowledge and third person objective modeling.
Hmm.
Uh, and also problematizes the privileging of scientific and descriptive language above other forms of language.
Hmm.
And modernity is obsessed with the idea that people are out there who think there's stuff that can't be explained by science, and those crazy people who think there's stuff that can't be explained by science should be stopped because science is the best, right? And so reads a little bit like that.
Hmm.
To which most postmodernists are like, come on, like science is cool, but there's so much that science has destroyed or silenced because of its claim to be the only way to speak about the universe that's true.
Well, do you think that science is self-correcting in the way I was saying earlier, like by the fact that there is then the accumulation of evidence against, you could say, or indicting of science as it has been done in the past, can't we then factor that into our own updated understanding of the world and say, hey, that's not good, let's do science differently? I mean, isn't that what we're already seeing in the academy in terms of people trying to bring in the perspectives of marginalized groups and trying to situate science among other methodologies, these sorts of things? Like, it seems like that, but to the degree that that's successful, I feel like that's just, in a sense, science having its sort of auto self-reflective update of itself.
Again, I don't, it's not, there's not like one science. There's all
Yeah,
of these different institutionalized sciences. And I'm of the belief that, of course, science self corrects. That's because natural human language use self corrects, right? So it's this idea that science boots from a more primordial process of learning. That
hmm,
more primordial process of learning is the natural ability for linguistic communities to self correct with regards to the world. Like your description of what you were seeking when you said world modeling is all stuff that monkeys do and little kids do. Like if you just want to circumambulate the environment and not fall over and not piss anybody off and get yourself in trouble, if that's all you need to do, you don't need science. You need very simple everyday intuitions. But science is a weird enterprise by evolutionary survival standards. Like if you just want to survive, be a slime mold, right? If survival is your main thing, then you don't need all of this. And so there's just this thinking about, okay, right, postmodernism is like, okay. And then if you look at institutionalized science, it's not that science has looked at all the possible questions and in a disinterested manner, the scientists have set out to answer them all in a way that would give us the most useful picture of the universe. That's not what happened, right? Science emerged in this very complex wedding to the industrial apparatus and the nation state and the war apparatus and the academy, so that the image we get of science, like Shannon information theory and other things, come from a world that wasn't built to tell us the most about the universe. It was it was built to tell us a lot of stuff that's true, but not in a way that would provide a coherent and humane positioning of the human, but rather in a way that would aggregate power and make a lot of things possible, uh, technologically and politically. Which
yeah,
I'm not saying that's a terrible thing. I'm just recognizing that this notion that sciences somehow have, like, it's not, where it's a bunch of very complex individuals in with
sure.
vested interests and finances and politics and all of that. And that's again what the postmodernists showed. Like, don't hold science on a pedestal, and also don't castigate religion. That's, I think, would be the other thing I would say, is that there's a kind of like, yeah, the God you don't believe in doesn't exist. Like that horse is dead. You don't have to kick that horse. The question is, what's still valuable?
Hmm.
These belief systems of which the majority of the world believe. It's not like the majority of the world's like, yay, science. The majority of the world is like, oh my God, the scientists are coming. They're going to
Mm.
give us a bunch of technology and take over our country. We believe in religion, which tells us to be nice and not do that. Right? That's like, or to just kill those motherfuckers, right? And so that's, I think, the other factor is that David J. Temple wants to find a way to speak to the religious believers and actually
Hmm.
bring peace between them and the
Well,
technologists.
that last part, that is interesting because when you were talking about earlier the role of the philosopher, there seemed to be a bit of like 4D chess in some of the way you were talking in terms of like trying to tell the best story that isn't heretical, that is optimal for all people in a sense. It's also like there's a
Yeah,
lot of rhetorical
there has to
mo
be. Again,
yeah.
that's the thing. Like with you mentioned that things are not great in the intro to your book, right?
Mhm.
Like I think like Bobby Zarin's book or something. There's no mention that the world's in crisis or that there's a crisis or anything. And so, yeah, I'm very concerned about the layer of superstructure. How do we get people to believe things that are radically sane and that are sane and true? Because that's what sanity means, and that stops them from getting co-opted by these dangerous, I would call them transhumanist or test
Yeah.
grill ideologies, where if you start to say that we're computation and we start to say the whole thing is just a big computer and you start to say stuff like that, as opposed to start talking about actually, no, we live in this nested intersubjective world of mutual commitment and it's infused with love and it's non-mechanical and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, but again, if your goal is to convert scientists to transition out of reduction
Hmm.
into re-enchantment,
Yeah.
then you're golden. Uh,
I think that's largely that would largely be where I'd position my
totally,
intervention of trying to
totally,
speak to scientifically literate and informed and
exactly.
intellectually active people who get a certain picture of the world but also see the brokenness of things and are like, hey,
Yeah,
yeah.
super
So,
important, super
yeah.
important. And then my argument with them, then you do that, and then they're like, then what do I do? And then they look at all these religions, and they're like, okay, what are these?
Mm,
That's why there's this broader
sure.
need to find a way to
Yeah.
interanimate that. But all right, I got to run, man. This was
Yeah.
useful. And we'll talk more about this, I think. And
Yeah.
more writing is taking place all the time in our various schools of thought, and so it'll just be fun to keep that moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you so much, man. This was great and appreciate the work that you're doing and taking the time to get into these into the weeds a bit. This is good
Yeah.
stuff. So, till next time.